I talk a lot about VorpX in this channel. I love VorpX and I love what it can do. I love the fact that you can take your non-VR games or your flat screen games and transform them into VR games and breathe some new life into some games that you may have forgotten about or just wanted to try in VR. But I've often wondered, how much performance are you leaving on the table when you are using VorpX to run these games in VR? Or how powerful of a system do you actually need to use VorpX in order to run these games in VR? And today, we're going to find that out. I took 3 games and benchmarked them, and I want to show you the results, and they're pretty interesting. So without further ado, let's get into it. What's going on, everyone? Josh here at For Games. Now, before we get into the benchmarks, I feel it's necessary to actually talk about the PC that I use or the test bench that I used in order to get these benchmarks, so that way you at home can actually compare them to this PC here and kind of get an idea of how VorpX will actually be affected on your own system. The motherboard that I'm using is an MSI MPG X570 Gaming Edge Wi-Fi board with an AM4 socket, coupled with a Ryzen 7 3800X clocked at 3.9 GHz with a turbo boost of 4.5 GHz. The CPU is also being cooled by a Corsair H115i AIO with the fan speeds running at 1100 RPM. The memory that I'm running in this system is two 16GB sticks of DDR4 Corsair Vengeance LPX memory, clocked in at 3200 MHz. I know it's a bit overkill for what we're doing here, but I was video editing on this system, so I just threw in 32GB just to be on the safe side at one point. For a GPU, we have an oldie but a goodie. It's a GTX 1080 Founders Edition at stock clocks, and also my CPU is also at stock clocks. This is all being powered by a Corsair RM1000X power supply, and this is all being housed by a Corsair 5000D airflow case. And to keep all this fair, all the games that I'm benchmarking here today are running at 1920 by 1080 with VSync turned off, so we can get the maximum amount of FPS being pushed to the headsets as possible. Oh, and just to clarify, if you guys do try using VorpX, your mileage may vary and may be vastly different than what I'm getting here in these benchmarks. So just keep that in mind. Now that we know what the test bench is, let's get into the benchmarks. The first game we're going to take a look at here is Grid Autosport. Now, this is the flat screen run that I did, and it starts off at around 120 to 130 FPS and then slowly creeps up to around 170 FPS and then pretty much averages out right there. So we have a pretty good baseline around 170 FPS to start with. Now, the most important thing to look at here is the RAM usage. Now, this game is running at around 10.3 gigabytes of RAM that's being used. And overall, that's not too bad considering most systems nowadays require you, most games nowadays require you to use around 16 gigabytes of RAM to actually play the game anyway. The most demanding games like Doom Eternal, Doom, all those games. So this isn't that bad, and having 32 gigs in my system is pretty optimal for that. Now, the CPU is running around 60 degrees at 4.3 megahertz the entire time, and the GPU is running around 1810 megahertz the entire time, 1800 megahertz give or take, and it runs pretty standardly. You know, it's running pretty well. Now, let's take a look at the Quest 2 Grid Autosport benchmark here, and we're going to start off right away noticing a big difference here, and it starts off around 80 FPS. And then it slowly creeps up to around 100, then goes about to 106, and then it stays around 106 FPS just about the entire time. Every now and then, you're going to see the Quest 2 or the Grid Autosport with the Quest 2 bump up to about 120, 121 FPS, and then drop back down to about 80 to 90 FPS, which is pretty good. But the RAM usage here is what is getting me. This is the most interesting thing here, is the RAM usage. Now, it's running at 14.9 gigabytes of RAM being used. 14.9, so nearly 5 gigabytes more of RAM is being used just by running Grid Autosport with the Oculus Quest 2 in VorpX. Everything else is pretty much the same. Our CPU is running around 64 degrees at 4.3 gigahertz, so everything else is pretty much standard fare. Now let's compare the Oculus Quest 2 performance to the Reverb G2 and see how it does. Now this is where things started to get really interesting to me, mostly because of the frame rate. Now, the frame rate in this on the G2 is locked at 90 FPS. It does not move from that whatsoever. And coincidentally enough, that is the refresh rate of the G2 itself, so 90 Hz. So you shouldn't expect anything higher than 90 FPS when you're trying to game or play VR on the G2 itself, even using VorpX. And the other thing that's pretty interesting to me is the amount of RAM being used. Now, I don't know if this is a Windows mixed reality headset thing or it's just more optimized for being run on Windows with VorpX or something, but 12.3 gigabytes of RAM is being used, so 2.5 gigs less than running it on the Oculus Quest 2. So needless to say, if you have a Windows mixed reality headset and you want to run Grid Autosport in VR with VorpX and you have 16 gigs of RAM, you should be good to go. Now let's take a look at another title and see how things compare. So let's go take a look at Portal 2. Now going into this test with Portal 2, I really wasn't expecting a big performance drop while trying to run it in VR on the Oculus Quest 2 or the G2 using VorpX. This game can pretty much run on a potato if you wanted to. It's very, very easy to run. And as you can see from the flat screen footage here, I'm only using about 10 gigs of RAM and it's running at about 300 frames per second, which I think the game caps out at while in gameplay. And everything else here, GPU is at 75 degrees Celsius, the CPU is at 61 degrees Celsius at 4.3 gigahertz. And 14% CPU usage. This game basically takes nothing to run, and 300 frames per second is nothing to scoff at either when you're running it in VSync off in 1080p. But let's compare that now to the Oculus Quest 2 version of the game. Now after loading up Portal 2 on the Oculus Quest 2, I did notice quite a few things that were different, and I didn't really appreciate the gameplay as much as I should have. Now I was getting around 120 FPS, which is the refresh rate of the Oculus Quest 2, but I am using 5 gigs more RAM like I did in Grid Autosport 2, and as you can see there's kind of a trend going on here. But with the Quest 2 I did get quite a few dips down to the 50s and 60 range of FPS, and then it jumps back up to 120. The recording does do it justice, I'm sorry to say that, but it does. And everything else with the CPU is pretty much the same. I'm using quite a bit more CPU now at 41%, 42%, which I really wasn't expecting. And overall, the gameplay experience wasn't that great, as you can see with the gameplay footage here. It's very stuttery, very laggy. I just don't recommend playing it on the Quest 2. But how does Portal 2 fare on the G2? So why don't we go have a look at that. Portal 2 running on the Reverb G2 is just a much better experience overall. The frame rate is locked at 90 frames per second. It doesn't deviate from that much at all, like 1 FPS maybe, and it's using a little bit less RAM than the Oculus Quest 2 at 12.2, 12.3 gigabytes of RAM being used. And it's also a little bit less intense on the CPU as well, so you're using about 22%, 25% CPU utilization here compared to the 40%, 50% on the Quest 2, but it's still higher than running it in flat screen. So I would say if you're going to run Portal 2 or you want to run Portal 2 in VR with VorpX, I recommend using either a Windows Mixed Reality headset or something like an HTC Vive that requires Steam VR or something along those lines, because you're just going to get a much better experience overall. Now we still have one more game that we're going to test out, and it should be a pretty good indicator of how VorpX impacts performance on your PC, and that game is Resident Evil 7. Here is the flat screen test run of Resident Evil 7, and as you can see, we start off at around 134 FPS. Now the scene is mostly dark and there's a lot to render in the shadows and everything else, but eventually during the action scenes, it's coming up in a little bit, it does taper down to about 115 FPS, and that's where I average it out about there. As you can see, my RAM utilization is around 10.5 gigs of RAM, but my GPU temperatures have definitely come up to 82 degrees Celsius. This title is a pretty demanding title on the GPU, and it does take a lot of horsepower to run this. And as you can see, everything else with the temperatures and the CPU and the utilization of the CPU, it's not bad. I'm only using about 14 to 15% of my CPU at 4.3 gigahertz, and overall it runs fairly well at 120 to 115 FPS. So let's go take a look at the Oculus Quest 2 version of the game now and see how that runs. Now with the Oculus Quest 2 here, I did notice a bit of an anomaly, and I wasn't really expecting this. My RAM usage is about the same as my flat screen version of the game, so it runs about 10.5 to 10.8 gigabytes of RAM, but my frame rate has dropped dramatically. It's actually been cut in half, and I'm only using about 60 frames a second. And I don't know why this is, because the Oculus Quest 2 can go up to 120 frames a second on its panels, but here I'm getting 60 frames per second consistently throughout the run. It doesn't really matter if I get into a more action-oriented scene or just running through this first part in the basement of the house. It just runs the same. The temps in the GPU are around the same at 82 degrees Celsius, and my utilization is around the same as well at 76 to 75% utilization there. But my CPU definitely has increased to 61 degrees Celsius from the 50 degrees Celsius it was at before, and my utilization has also come up about 10%. So I'm running around 25 to 26% utilization at 4.3 gigahertz. Not a bad run, but I really can't recommend playing Resident Evil 7 with the Oculus Quest 2 using VorpX. Now let's go take a look at the G2 and see how this compares to the Oculus Quest 2. Here with the Reverb G2, we notice the biggest difference. And the first thing you're going to notice is the frame rate. It pretty much stays locked at 90 FPS for the most part. It does dip down to around 45 FPS to 60 FPS, depending on the action scene or the lighting inside of the scene, but for the most part it's at 90 FPS, a nice smooth gameplay experience, and inside the headset it does seem like it stays at that 90 frame per second frame rate. It doesn't seem like it drops down at all. Nice smooth buttery gameplay, no micro stuttering, no nothing, and it just is a dream to play on the G2. RAM utilization is about 13.3 gigabytes, and that is a little bit more than the Oculus Quest 2, which is a complete switch from what we've seen in previous tests. Usually the Oculus Quest 2 does use more RAM, about 5 gigs more, but in this test, it actually used the same amount as flat screen, and the G2 is using a little more, but it does seem to pay off when you're actually playing the game inside the actual headset. Now with the GPU, we are at 82 degrees Celsius, 91 to 94% GPU utilization, and my CPU is still at 61 degrees and about 25 to 30% utilization here. So overall, the Reverb G2 does handle VorpX with Resident Evil 7 very well, and like I said, inside the headset it does play nice and smooth. It doesn't give you any stuttering or anything, and it's just a dream to play inside the G2. So if you do have a G2, I highly recommend playing Resident Evil 7 with VorpX in VR. It is so much fun in VR if you have never tried it. Give it a shot. So with all the benchmarks out of the way, it really doesn't seem like VorpX is putting much of an undue strain onto your system. Where I think the strain is coming from, or the extra resources are being used, is actually being used with the Oculus Link software, or the Oculus software with the Oculus Quest 2, and the Windows Mixed Reality software for the G2. And I may do a follow-up video using my OG Vive over here to kind of test this theory, so make sure you subscribe to check that out. But the bottom line here is, if you're looking to use VorpX to play some of your games in VR, I really wouldn't worry about the VorpX overhead. It's pretty much non-existent. But if you have something like a 1500X or a 6-core Ryzen any generation or an 8-core Ryzen any generation, I wouldn't be too worried about that either. And if you have a GPU from RX 480, 580, or a GTX 1070, or even a 1080, or maybe even a 1060, you should be pretty much good to go to run any games that you want in VR using VorpX without an overhead penalty. But I do recommend going to 16 gigs of RAM if possible. And that is pretty much it for this video. If you guys found this video useful and helpful in any way, give this video a big thumbs up, because it really does help out the channel and helps us reach new people out there. But until next time guys, I'm Josh with Photo Lover Games, signing out. Have a great day.